The year was 1930, and the Canadian North lay blanketed in thick, bitter snow. Among the many fur trappers who roamed those frozen lands was Joe LaBelle, a man hardened by cold winds and long solitude. He had spent much of his life crisscrossing the isolated trails of the Kivalliq region, familiar with every ridge, frozen stream, and wind-worn tree along the way. This time of year in early November, he was headed toward a small Inuit village that sat quietly near the shores of Lake Anjikuni. He'd been there before. The villagers were kind, offering warm food, a fire, and a roof over his head when the northern winds turned cruel. It wasn't a big settlement, perhaps 30 souls in total, but it was lively. Joe enjoyed their company. Their children laughed without fear, and their elders always greeted him with stories that ran deep as the tundra. Joe trudged through knee-deep snow, his rifle slung over his back and his pack weighed down with supplies. The sky was pale gray, sunless, as if twilight had chosen to stretch itself across the land indefinitely. Ravens occasionally cut through the air above, their cries sharp and sudden against the silence. But other than that, it was still. Too still. As he neared the familiar cluster of homes by late afternoon, something gnawed at him. The usual smoke rising from chimneys was absent. No barking of sled dogs, no children racing out to greet him. Just the sound of snow crunching under his boots and his own breath fogging in the icy air. He slowed his pace. Something wasn't right. Joe reached the outer edge of the village. Silence. Not the usual peaceful stillness of snow, but a heavy, unnatural kind of silence that seemed to press against his ears like wool. He paused at the first house. The door stood ajar. He knocked once. No answer. Cautiously, he stepped inside. A small fire still glowed faintly in the hearth. A pot of caribou stew sat on a table, half finished, a spoon resting beside it. Clothes hung neatly on a wooden peg. A child's toy, woven from seal hide and bone, lay on the floor, but no people. The house felt freshly lived in, and yet it was empty. Joe backed out slowly, now frowning deeply. He moved to the next hut. The same, doors open, food left as if dinner had been interrupted, belongings untouched. No blood, no signs of struggle, just gone. He called out then, his voice loud in the freezing air. "Hello? Anyone here?" The sound echoed across the village, bouncing between the huts and then fading into nothing. No answer. Evening was falling now, casting long blue shadows on the snow. Joe gathered his coat tighter around him. He didn't scare easily. He'd fought off wolves before, survived ice storms, even broken a leg miles from shelter and crawled back to safety. But this was different. This felt wrong. He decided to spend the night in the largest hut, one he remembered belonged to the village elder. He needed to rest, warm himself, and think. Maybe they'd gone hunting. Maybe something had forced them to leave quickly. But he knew deep down, no Inuit clan leaves like this. Not without their dogs, not without their dead. As he lit the fire and tried to calm his thoughts, he had no idea what other horrors the morning would bring. Morning came slowly in the north, as if the sun was hesitant to rise. When it finally breached the horizon, its light brought no warmth, only a thin gold hue that danced weakly across the snowdrifts. Joe LaBelle awoke inside the large hut surrounded by quiet. Not peaceful quiet, hollow quiet. The fire had gone out overnight. Frost had crept in along the corners of the room like an invasive fog, clutching onto every wooden surface and creeping up the panes of thin animal hide windows. Joe pulled himself up from his pile of furs and stepped out into the cold. Still no one. The village sat perfectly still, as though frozen in time. The snow was undisturbed, no fresh footprints, no sled tracks, nothing but the faint indentations from when Joe had arrived. He visited more homes, all the same. In each one, he found evidence of life interrupted. A bowl of porridge hardened from cold, a pair of mittens half sewn, needles still in the fabric, a spear leaning against the wall ready to be taken for hunting. But the people were gone, not a single soul to be found. No signs of departure, no packed sleds, no removed belongings, no written messages, nothing that made sense. In one home, Joe found a kettle hanging over long dead embers. Tea leaves had settled at the bottom of an icy pool. A rocking chair sat still, mid-rock, as if someone had just stood up and vanished. In another, a dog's collar lay near the door, but the dog it belonged to was nowhere. He climbed a ridge just above the village to get a better view, hoping to spot movement, footprints heading outward, a trail, anything. But all that stretched around the hamlet was snow. Miles and miles of untouched snow. Then he spotted something strange by the tree line. Several wooden posts, spaced evenly apart in a line. Joe climbed down and approached them. As he got closer, a chill that had nothing to do with the cold passed through him. Each post had a sled dog tied to it. They were all dead. 8 of them, still harnessed, still waiting, as if their owners had left them there expecting to return, but never did. The dogs hadn't starved. Their bodies were frozen. But Joe could tell they'd died violently, in agony. Some had bite marks. Others had simply collapsed. Tongues hanging out, eyes wide open. Their fur was frosted stiff. Joe knelt beside them, removed his hat, and muttered a prayer. He'd known these animals. They were part of the villagers' daily lives, essential partners in this frozen world. No Inuit family would ever abandon their dogs. It was unthinkable. A soft wind moved through the trees, carrying with it a low, distant hum. It didn't sound like the usual wind. It had rhythm to it, almost like a chant. Joe stood quickly, eyes scanning, nothing there. The trees swayed gently in the breeze, but nothing else moved. The sound stopped. He took one step back toward the village when he saw it. The cemetery. It sat just outside the village, a small patch of land marked by bone totems and stone cairns where the villagers buried their dead. Joe walked toward it slowly, his boots crunching in rhythm with his heart. As he entered the burial site, something felt off. Several graves had been dug up, not fresh, not by animals. The snow around them was smooth, undisturbed, yet the graves themselves were open, some shallow, some deep, all empty. The stone markers were neatly placed beside the pits, like someone had respectfully removed them before extracting what lay beneath. Joe's skin crawled. Who would dig up the dead in the dead of winter, and why? Then he noticed one detail that truly unnerved him. There were no footprints around the graves, not a single mark, not even snow that had drifted in. It was as if the graves had been opened from beneath. Joe staggered back, his breathing uneven. He clutched his rifle, suddenly feeling very, very alone. He returned to the village and began shouting again, louder this time. "Is anyone here?" Only the empty huts answered. It was nearly dusk by the time Joe retreated to the elder's hut again. He didn't eat. He didn't even bother to relight the fire. As darkness fell outside, the wind picked up. The hut creaked. Then from somewhere in the village he heard footsteps. Heavy, deliberate. They crunched once, then silence. Then again, closer. Joe held his breath, grabbing his rifle. He pushed aside the door flap and stepped out into the cold night. Nothing, no one, just snow. The moon had risen now, casting long shadows across the village. Every hut looked the same, silent, empty, watching. Joe turned around, and that's when he saw something in the sky. Just above the lake's surface, floating, faint yet clearly visible, were lights. 3 of them, glowing softly in a triangular formation. Not moving like stars, not shimmering like auroras. Just there, hanging in the air. They pulsed once, then began to move, silently gliding across the lake's surface, dipping low and vanishing behind the trees. Joe stared for several long seconds, his body frozen by something deeper than cold. He didn't try to explain it. He didn't even try to understand it. He simply turned back into the hut, shut the door, and didn't sleep. By the time dawn broke the next morning, Joe LaBelle had made up his mind. He would leave. He didn't know where the villagers had gone. He didn't understand what he'd seen hovering over the lake. But something deep within him, some primal instinct born from years of surviving the wild, told him this place was wrong. Something had happened here, something that couldn't be explained with logic or wilderness knowledge. Joe didn't waste time. He packed his gear, loaded his rifle, and stepped out into the brittle cold. But before he could leave the village behind, something pulled at him, a thought he couldn't shake. If he didn't report this, no one would ever know. The village would remain a forgotten ghost on the map, and the mystery would vanish like the people who lived here. So instead of heading deeper into the wild toward his next trapping route, he turned south, toward civilization. It would take him 2 full days to reach the nearest telegraph station, but he had to tell someone. Someone had to know. As he began the long trek through snow-covered woods and frozen riverbeds, Joe couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Several times he turned sharply, gripping his rifle, only to see nothing. Trees. Wind. Occasionally a raven, circling far overhead. But no animals followed him. No wolves, no lynx, not even tracks of hares or moose. Just snow and more snow. That absence itself was unnatural. In the Canadian wild, something is always moving. But here, nothing. By the time he made camp that night, exhaustion was beginning to take its toll. He found a small rock overhang for shelter, lit a small fire, and sat staring into it. The silence pressed in like a vice, and the only sound he could hear was the crackling wood and his own uneven breathing. Then a sound in the woods. It started as a low hum, like wind through branches, but deeper, almost musical, like a low chant far away. Joe grabbed his rifle and stood slowly. The firelight flickered across his face. The humming grew louder, then stopped. He scanned the woods. Still nothing. He was sure it had come from behind the trees to the west, toward Lake Anjikuni. But now it was gone. Suddenly he realized something chilling. There were footprints in the snow, not his. He'd walked in a straight line from the lake, careful and alone, and the snow had remained clean all the way. But now, just a few yards from his fire, there were bare footprints, sunken deep into the frost. Small, human, unshod. And they led directly to his campfire. Joe raised his rifle, backing up until he felt the stone wall behind him. His eyes scanned the tree line. Nothing moved. The prints ended abruptly a few feet from where he now stood. No return path, no sign of where the person had gone, as if they had walked to the fire and then vanished. Joe didn't sleep that night. He kept the fire going until dawn, sitting with his back against the rock wall, rifle across his lap. When morning came, the footprints were still there. No melting. No snow had fallen to cover them, just frozen proof that someone or something had come in the night. He set off again at first light. 2 days later, he reached the telegraph station at the Pass, Manitoba. Joe stumbled through the doors of the telegraph station like a man chased by shadows. His boots were caked in snow, his face drawn and pale. The attendant, a young man named Harold Myron, jumped to his feet. "My God, man, are you all right?" he asked. Joe didn't answer immediately. He simply pointed at the telegram forms and said, "Get the Mounties, now!" Harold stared at him for a moment before nodding and rushing to the wire. Within the hour, A message had gone out to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Joe sat in the corner, refusing tea, refusing food, just staring out the window with red-rimmed eyes. When the Mounties arrived the next morning, led by Constable Sergeant J. Nelson, Joe recounted everything, from the empty village to the dead dogs to the opened graves. Sergeant Nelson was skeptical, but curious. He was a veteran of many winters in the north, a man who had heard his share of legends and ghost stories. But Joe's story wasn't wild-eyed superstition. He told it slowly, methodically, without exaggeration, just cold, horrifying facts. "I didn't imagine it," Joe said flatly. "The huts were full of life, but the people were gone, as if they'd vanished in the middle of the day. I saw lights, I heard singing, and something walked right up to my fire without leaving again." Nelson stared at him for a long moment before nodding. "We'll go see for ourselves." 3 days later, when the Mounties reached the village, Joe now staying behind in town, they were greeted with the same ghostly silence. It was exactly as Joe described it. Fires had burned down, food remained uneaten, and the sled dogs were dead, frozen in place. The graves were still open. There were no signs of struggle. No storm damage, no animal tracks, no footprints. Nelson's men searched the area thoroughly. They found no evidence of mass departure, no paths through the woods, no human waste or discarded items that would suggest a migration. It was like the people of Anjikuni had simply ceased to exist. But the final straw came on their second night there. Just after midnight, Constable Emile Raoul, standing watch at the edge of the village, reported seeing 3 glowing lights over the lake. No sound, no wind, just floating orbs. He'd been a man of reason. But afterward, his hands trembled. He refused to speak of it again. The Mounties returned to the Paz with a full report, and the official file was quietly buried. No press release, no follow-up. No investigation into the missing 30-something men, women, and children of Anjikuni. By the time the Royal Canadian Mounted Police had left Lake Anjikuni, their official stance was clear. There had been an unexplained absence of the village's inhabitants. But there would be no formal statement, no call for help, no follow-up investigation. The report vanished into the depths of bureaucracy, never reaching the public eye. But word spread. Not from the Mounties, but from Joe LaBelle. Joe couldn't keep silent. The things he had seen, the frozen dogs, the opened graves, the lights, they haunted his sleep. Even after returning to civilization, he found no comfort. He drank to numb the memories, but the images always returned. Worse still, he wasn't the only one seeing lights. Weeks after Joe's report, strange messages began arriving at remote telegraph stations throughout northern Manitoba and Nunavut. These weren't from trappers or hunters, but from wireless operators, radio technicians, and bush pilots. They all said the same thing: unusual aerial activity above the tundra. A pilot named Francis McLean reported 3 lights chasing each other in wide arcs above the tree line. No sound, no wings. A missionary, Father Leclerc, wrote of ghostly lights appearing over a frozen lake during evening prayer, which vanished the moment he opened the chapel door. Even some Inuit hunters, those who had refused to settle near Lake Anjikuni, spoke of sky spirits returning to the earth. Many linked the lights to old legends. The Inuit had long told stories of Tunaruksajuit, sky beings who could walk among the living, take forms of family members, and steal the breath of those they chose. When the story finally reached the Ottawa offices, it was dismissed as folklore and rumor. A mass migration, they said. The villagers likely left for better grounds. But those familiar with Inuit tradition knew better. They do not abandon their dead. Joe's return to the lake, against all warnings. Something about the silence from the Mounties gnawed at Joe. He couldn't let it go. By early December, barely a month after his initial discovery, he decided to return to Anjikuni. This time he brought two companions, Derek Moore, a half-Inuit guide who had known the area well, and William Will Carter, a skeptical geologist who thought he might explain the lights as aurora phenomena. "Just lights," Will had said, brushing off Joe's tail. "You trapper types get spooked easy in the dark." They set out with dogs and supplies. The snow was deeper now, and ice cracked beneath their sleds. Wind howled over the ridges, carrying whispers that neither man could explain. By the time they reached the lake's edge, the sun was sinking, and Anjikuni stood still as ever. "Looks exactly like you said," Will admitted uneasily. "Too still." They made camp inside the same elder's hut. The fire lit, stew boiling, rifles nearby. As night fell, the air changed, not colder but heavier, like a storm approaching but with no wind. Even the dogs grew restless. One whined constantly, another refused to eat. Derek sat by the door listening. "I heard that sound again," he finally said. "That hum, like the ones my grandfather talked about." At exactly 11:13 p.m., the hut shook. Not violently, but just enough that the hanging lantern swayed. Joe stood and yanked open the door. What he saw would stay burned into his memory forever. Out over the frozen lake, 3 spheres of light hung motionless above the surface. Same formation as before, same glow, a dull silver white, like moonlight run through smoke. Then, as if choreographed, they began to move. Not randomly, precisely. Spiraling upward in silence, rotating around each other like stars caught in an orbit. Faster and faster until suddenly, gone, no streak, no sound. Just instant disappearance. Will, who had rushed to the door beside Joe, whispered, "That's no aurora." Joe didn't answer. He just kept staring, heart pounding. Behind them, Derek made a sharp sound. They turned. One of the dogs was missing. Its leash had been severed, not chewed, not torn, cut clean. They searched the area, no tracks, no snow disturbed, as if the animal had simply evaporated. That night, no one slept. Will Carter, ever the skeptic, had kept a small leather-bound notebook. After returning from Anjikuni, he wrote one final entry before refusing to speak of the journey again. "I saw them. I saw the lights. They moved with purpose. Too structured, too synchronized for anything natural. The dog vanished. Derek saw it go, says it walked backward into thin air. But what haunts me most is the silence. How you can hear your own heartbeat in that place. Something lives beneath that lake. Something waiting." By the time spring thaw came in 1931, a few Inuit travelers passed near the abandoned site. They did not stay. One elder, Niviak, said simply, "They were taken. The land is still listening." To this day, no trace of the villagers has ever been found. No skeletons, no diaries, no explanations. The graves remain open. The sled posts still stand. And every few years, a bush pilot or lone hunter reports strange lights above the now frozen lake. But no one dares settle there again. Anjikuni is now marked only on old maps and in whispered stories passed from one fire to another. The events surrounding Lake Anjikuni were quietly dismissed by Canadian authorities. The few reports that surfaced in local newspapers were vague, framed as seasonal migrations or severe weather displacement. No mention was made of the lights, no mention of the severed leash, and certainly no mention of opened graves. Sergeant Nelson, who had led the 1st Mountie team, retired early just months later. His last assignment remained unspoken. In his final letter to headquarters, he simply wrote, "I don't know what we saw, but the wilderness has rules we don't understand. Anjikuni is not a place for the living anymore." Later that year, an amateur radio operator named Jacob Thorne, stationed near Churchill, Manitoba, reported a strange transmission on an unused Arctic frequency. It lasted for 19 seconds. He described it as a chorus of distant voices, low, monotone, almost robotic. But among the static and distortion, one word stood out: Nivanik. It was a word unfamiliar to Jacob, but not to the Inuit. Nivanik means to vanish, leaving no trace. The signal never repeated, but Jacob documented it, and for the rest of his life he claimed it came from the vicinity of Anjikuni Lake. 10 years later, in 1941, a young Inuit hunter named Taktuk ventured near the area during a seasonal caribou hunt. He didn't know the stories. He was just following tracks. When he returned days later, alone and trembling, he refused to speak for days. Finally, to a village elder, he whispered, "The land blinked. The sky opened. The ice cracked. I heard drums below the snow. Taktuk would never hunt again. His hair turned white within a year. He died young." Some say the lights followed him in his dreams. Though Anjikuni village no longer exists on modern maps, satellite images show the remnants of fire pits, tent outlines, and a perfectly circular impression in the lake ice, nearly 200 feet wide. In 2001, a remote Canadian documentary team attempted to locate the village ruins. They never arrived. Their last known GPS ping was just east of Lake Anjikuni. The team was found 5 days later, lost in the forest, dehydrated and confused. The tapes they recorded were blank, except one, which captured 6 minutes of faint humming and a voice repeating, "We are still here." Joe LaBelle never returned to the wild after his second journey. He lived a quiet, solitary life near Winnipeg, working as a groundskeeper and occasional wilderness guide, but never north. In 1956, a young journalist tracked him down, hoping for an interview about the Anjikuni case. Joe refused. But before the journalist left, Joe handed him a worn leather journal and said, "You want a story? Fine. But it's not a happy one. They weren't taken by snow or wolves or cold. They were taken by silence." Inside the journal was the final entry Joe ever wrote about the incident. "When we live too far from the world, something else finds us. Something older than time." The people of Anjikuni didn't just disappear. They were unmade. Joe died a year later of natural causes, but some say he left behind instructions in his will to never be buried in the ground. He was cremated. Today, the mystery of Anjikuni remains one of the most unsettling disappearances in Canadian history. No remains have ever been recovered. No migration records exist. No signs of war, famine, or disease. Just one village. Gone, and lights, always the lights. Those who speak of Anjikuni now do so quietly, by firelight, or over crackling radio waves in the Arctic night. They say if you go there and sit in the stillness long enough, you'll hear them. Footsteps in the snow, a faint humming, and voices whispering in a language no one alive remembers. Somewhere, beyond the map's edge and beyond reason, Anjikuni sleeps beneath snow and silence. And though no one dares settle there again, the land waits. Not for rescue, not for justice, but perhaps for the rest of us.